For many American travelers, Europe's ancient streets feel less like history, more like a suspiciously well-maintained Hollywood backlot. This immediate, pervasive sense of unreality isn't about a lack of education or appreciation. It's a profound cultural reveal. It's a stark illumination of two completely different relationships with time, authenticity, and the very fabric of reality. I've spent years documenting and deconstructing this fascinating rift, where America's deeply ingrained concept of a curated past collides with Europe's lived-in present, where history isn't an exhibit you visit, but the worn floorboards you stand upon. This culture shock often begins with a simple, jarring question, revealing a foundational misunderstanding in its very premise. A visitor walks into a pub in Bath, one whose timber frame has held the weight of conversations since the 15th century. She admires the low ceilings, the blackened beams, the sense of age. And then she asks, with genuine curiosity, "So, when did they build this replica?" You provide the factual date, 1483. She nods thoughtfully, translating this information into her own cultural lexicon. Right, so it's themed after 1483. To her, antiquity is a design aesthetic, a conscious creative choice akin to a restaurant choosing a Prohibition-era vibe. She expects the profound darkness of the oak to be a painted stain, a special effect. She does not recognize it as the literal accretion of 500 years of hearth smoke, pipe tobacco, and human breath, a patina earned minute by generations who are no longer here to witness it. The bartender, a veteran of this exact exchange, might chuckle softly and tap a beam with his knuckle. "This isn't decor, love," he might say. "This is just what time looks like when it's left alone with wood." In that moment, two entirely different frameworks for understanding age are laid bare. One sees a themed environment. The other sees the physical residue of unbroken continuity. This perceptual gap extends to the very ground beneath their feet, the foundational layer of any civilization. In Cambridge, a tourist from a land of smooth, regulated sidewalks eyes the uneven, glacial cobblestones with practical concern. "These really aren't safe for strollers," he observes. "Why don't you just level them out? Pour some asphalt." You explain that monks laid these stones by hand centuries before his nation was a glimmer in an explorer's eye. He nods, his face a portrait of genuine, non-malicious puzzlement. So, there was no medieval ADA compliance committee. His question is sincere. To him, the past should logically conform to modern, enlightened standards of safety and convenience. It is an inefficiency to be corrected. To the stones themselves, worn smooth by millions of footsteps, his entire nation, its laws, its codes, its very existences, a recent, noisy footnote in a much longer, slower story. He is applying the user interface logic of his modern world to an operating system written in a different, older language. Is this simple ignorance, a lack of historical knowledge? Or is it something more subtle, a different kind of temporal literacy, one fluent in renewal but not in endurance? The distinction is critical. It's not that they don't know the dates. It's that the dates don't translate into a believable, material reality. This becomes even clearer at sites of monumental history, where scale amplifies the disconnect. At the Tower of London, a group of students on a heritage tour doesn't discuss conquests or monarchs. They speculate about logistics. How did they get the cranes in here to build this set? One wonders aloud. Another, more practically minded, asks, do they take the castle down in the winter for maintenance? To stop it from weathering too much? When a guide patiently explains that the White Tower has stood on this spot since 1078, the student doesn't reject the fact. Instead, she reframes it seamlessly into the native tongue of her commercial, branded world. Oh, wow. So, who holds the long-term brand licensing then? She isn't being disrespectful. She is making a genuine good faith effort to fit the concept of a millennium into the only framework she knows that deals with long-term value preservation, the marketplace. She sees corporate curation, sponsorship, and intellectual property management, where there is only the stark, unsponsored fact of continuous existence. She is looking for the board of directors behind the monument. This encapsulates the core misunderstanding. For many Americans, history is most commonly experienced as a curated exhibit. It is a destination, a bounded experience with an entrance fee, opening hours, and gift shop. It is something you do safely contained behind velvet ropes or glass cases. In vast swaths of Europe, however, history is not a destination. It is infrastructure. It is the foundation upon which you build your modern bank, the walls of your local pub, the building that houses your dentist's office. It is not separate from daily life. It is the often unnoticed stage upon which daily life performs. One treats the past as a discrete, consumable product. The other treats it as the inherited, often inconvenient, physical plant of contemporary society. This clash of frameworks plays out in countless subtle interactions. In the cavernous, awe-inspiring space of York Minster, a man gazes up at the magnificent stained glass windows, their jewel tones glowing in the diffuse English light. He turns to a guide, not with wonder, but with professional curiosity. How often do you guys have to replace these panels to keep them looking so authentically old? The guide's reply, "They are the originals, from the 14th century," simply doesn't compute. His brain, wired for maintenance schedules and planned renewals, seeks the project manager, the conservation team's 5-year plan, the hidden budget for replica creation. He cannot locate the hidden scaffolding because there is none. The original scaffolding was faith, medieval engineering, quarried limestone, and the sheer, stubborn passage of time. The concept that something so fragile-looking could survive the mere weather of 600 winters is itself the miracle. One that his paradigm of managed upkeep cannot easily accommodate. Why is this simple notion of permanence so psychologically difficult to believe in? The answer lies in the cultural environment that shaped the observer. In a society built on the principles of planned obsolescence, constant software updates, and the reinvention of cities within living memory, something that simply endures begins to feel suspicious. It feels like a deliberate artistic statement, a contrivance. An accident of survival. A building that just never fell down is reinterpreted as a masterful feat of preservation, a continuous, intentional act of curation. The idea that something could be old simply because no one ever got around to replacing it, or because it was built well enough to refuse to die, is foreign. Age, in this view, must be the result of effort, not neglect. This perceptual warp extends to the very artifacts we use to define antiquity. In the echoing halls of the British Museum, a father shepherds his children past a case of Egyptian funerary relics. He points, not with scholarly interest, but with the recognition of a consumer. "Look, kids," he says, "great props from the mummy." A nearby guard, overhearing, might murmur under his breath, "They're from a time before the concept of props was invented." The father nods, unfazed. Still, he concedes, they totally nailed the ancient vibe. In this moment, the artifact's profound historical truth is rendered less real, less authentic than its cinematic echo. The Hollywood blockbuster didn't borrow aesthetic cues from history. In his mind, it somehow authenticated it, gave it a recognizable, branded context. The original became a convincing copy of its own pop culture replica. This leads to a defining cultural metaphor in America. The past is often treated like a theme park, a clean, safe, narrativized environment designed for visitor enjoyment. In Europe, it's more like the inherited town you simply forgot to renovate a little damp, impractical, and full of odd angles, but unquestionably lived in and real. This perception warp touches everything, even the pastoral ideal. An American influencer seeking content in the picturesque Cotswolds films a charming 17th-century thatched cottage. The commitment to the aesthetic here is just amazing. She exclaims to her camera. A local walking his dog pauses and says dryly, "That's just Brian's house." He's a solicitor. The cottage isn't performing quaint. It isn't committing to an aesthetic. It is simply being a house. The thatch is there because it's a traditional roofing material, and Brian hasn't yet saved up for the expensive rethatching job it needs. The tourist sees a meticulously designed set piece. The local sees a drafty, maintenance-heavy building with a leak due to a bad patch of reed. One sees the image. The other sees the plumbing. Perhaps the most revealing moment of all comes from the unvarnished perspective of youth. A teenager on a school trip to the ruins of a medieval abbey stares at the soaring, roofless arches open to the sky. He isn't bored. He's analytically curious. He turns to the guide and asks, with utter earnestness, "So, who invented the concept of ruins?" He does not mean which king commissioned this abbey. He means what creative mind or marketing team first decided that broken and crumbling was a valid, desirable aesthetic. The guide, a master of British understatement, doesn't miss a beat. "Time," he replies, "and it's a brutally indifferent architect." The boy nods sagely, mentally filing time away in his mind alongside other innovative design firms. The natural process of entropy and decay has been reinterpreted as a conscious creative choice. This is where the cultural rift deepens into a philosophical chasm, the implicit assumption that age, to be valid, must serve a discernible commercial or narrative purpose in the present. This reaches its logical and humorous extreme in Stratford-upon-Avon. A tourist, eager for the full experience, approaches a guide at Shakespeare's birthplace. "Is the actor playing Shakespeare in today?" she asks brightly. The guide, momentarily stunned, explains that William Shakespeare, the man, died in 1616. The tourist's eyes widen, not with disappointment, but with deep admiration. Wow, that is next-level method acting. The commitment. In her framework, the past cannot simply be. It must be performed. It is an immersive, open-world theater production staffed by fantastically dedicated, unseen performers. The man isn't dead. He's just off stage, waiting for his next entrance cue. Reality becomes the most convincing bit of acting you've ever seen. This fundamental difference stems from a foundational approach to space and place. America, in many ways, builds new. It sees land as a blank canvas, a tabula rasa upon which to project new visions. Europe, by geographical and historical necessity, builds on. It sees land as a palimpsest in ancient manuscript where old text was scraped away to make room for the new, but where the ghost of the original writing always remains faintly visible beneath the surface. Every city is a layered artifact. When an American visitor sees a graceful Georgian townhouse now housing a sleek, modern pharmacy on its ground floor, they often see visual incongruity, a clash of styles. A local sees a story of efficient, pragmatic reuse. The building's function changed from a wealthy merchant's home to a retail space, but its bones stayed. The memory of its first life is carried in the proportion of its windows, the carving on its lintel, the thickness of its walls. It wasn't preserved. It was simply repurposed. This leads to another, more profound truth. You don't really visit European history in the way you visit a museum. More often, you simply bump into it on the way to buy milk. The grand narrative is embedded in the mundane errand. All of this culminates in a moment of beautiful, silent confusion. A family from the American Sunbelt visits the imposing bulk of Warwick Castle. The father, whose professional world is one of franchises and scalable business models, looks up at the formidable battlements and sees not a fortress, but a concept. He turns to the guide with entrepreneurial enthusiasm. You guys should really license this model. Seriously, it'd kill in Florida." The guide meets his gaze and smiles a soft, knowing smile. "We did," she says quietly. "It's called history." For a long moment, the man is silent. The penny drops with an almost audible thud. This isn't a concept that can be replicated in Orlando with better HVAC and wider gift shops. This is the singular, irreducible, unmovable weight of actual years of specific stones laid by specific hands for a specific, obsolete purpose that has somehow translated into timelessness. He wasn't looking at a castle. He was looking at time itself, made tangible in mortar and stone. And for the first time, perhaps, he viscerally believed in its reality, not as a story, but as a physical fact. The awe is always present in these interactions. It's just frequently misinterpreted as suspicion or doubt. The whispered comment, "This can't be real, it's too perfect," is not an insult. It is the raw, unfiltered human reaction to encountering an object or place older than your country's entire founding narrative. It breaks their story. It introduces a timescale so vast it momentarily short-circuits the brain's understanding of progress and decay. In a narrative of constant forward motion, an immutable anchor feels like a plot hole too. So, what is the practical takeaway for the curious traveler? It isn't to memorize more dates or kings. It's a subtler skill, a conscious shift in perceptual gaze. Stop looking for the flawless set design. Instead, train your eye to look for the repair. Look for the patch in the stone wall where a newer, slightly different stone was inserted 200 years ago. Look for the newer brick in the ancient arch, the modern plumbing snaking up the medieval exterior wall. These aren't flaws in the authenticity. They are the very story. They are the fingerprints of continuous adaptive life, the opposite of a curated, frozen display. Understand that preservation in this context often doesn't mean museumification. It means continued use. That 12th century church isn't a relic you tour for £5. It's where actual people from the parish get married on Saturday afternoon. The ancient Guildhall isn't just open for historical tours. It's where the town council meets every other Tuesday to argue bitterly about bicycle lanes and parking permits. The past isn't shelved. It's kept on as active, if occasionally cranky, staff. And finally, realize that the true magic isn't housed in the fact that something is old. The profound wonder is nested in the fact that the spectacularly ancient is also, simultaneously, boringly functional. The true marvel of a European city is not that it has a Roman wall, but that the Roman wall now forms the back of a car park. The wonder is that the spectacular and the mundane are the same thing. The cathedral spire and the grocery store share a zip code. And have for centuries, if this exploration of how we perceive the crushing weight and gentle persistence of centuries has reframed your own travel memories or sharpened your vision for future journeys, then you have grasped the essential mission of Winds of Thought. Our work is to decode the invisible, culturally constructed lenses through which we all view the world, to clean the glass so we might see each other and our shared history a little more clearly. If this perspective resonated with you, if it provided a new vocabulary for a familiar feeling, please support the channel by liking this video. That simple act is the surest, most powerful way to help us continue this work of cultural translation and insight. Subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, 'cause next week we are venturing into a very different but equally powerful social landscape. We will be exploring why Scandinavian silence is not an absence, but arguably the loudest, most nuanced social language you will ever encounter, a grammar of quiet, where everything is said in the spaces between words. Thank you for watching, for thinking, and for traveling with a curious mind. And remember, the oldest, most profound things in the world are rarely behind glass. More often, they are quietly holding up the roof of the perfectly ordinary cafe you're sitting in right now, asking for nothing more than to be noticed. not as a spectacle, but as a part of the unbroken, wonderfully inconvenient stream of life.